Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on biodiversity credits. I'm Alistair Scott from the Global Rewilding Alliance, and I'll be chairing today. We are recording this webinar so that we can put it up on our YouTube channel, so please bear that in mind if you make comments or whatever. By way of context, we know that billions of dollars, euros, pounds, etc. will be needed to help nature recover. Yet we know from the carbon markets that there can be complications with such things and worries about reliability. So our aim today is to think about how biodiversity credits can be well designed in order to benefit the global rewilding movement. We have a great panel of expert speakers here today, and to introduce the whole event, allow me first to call on Gregor Pipan, who is part of the team at CreditNature and a board member of the Global Rewilding Alliance. Gregor.
Thank you, Elisa. In face of biodiversity crisis today, where almost 70% of wildlife populations have been lost since 1970, rewilding presents a beacon of hope for reversing the negative trends. However, as Alistair pointed out, there is a $700 billion annual financing gap for the protection, restoration, and enhancement of nature. It is clear that public funds alone do not suffice to close this gap. So the search is on for financial instruments and mechanisms that could unlock private financial flows towards nature conservation and restoration. Following the examples in climate finance, today biodiversity credits are gaining traction, and maybe just for the avoidance of confusion, they can have different names such as nature units or nature credits. What really matters is what is under the hood here. So the idea behind them is to not only rely on the carbon component, but specifically on the biodiversity protection or uplift to generate financial flows for habitat restoration, species conservation and reintroduction, ecosystem protection, and different sustainable land management practices. So until this day, we have quite a few biodiversity credit frameworks emerging, both compliance and voluntary. However, the market is still at a very nascent stage, and probably more questions than answers remain till this date. But something that is of the utmost importance is that we have learned our lessons from the carbon markets and that we don't repeat them. So with this webinar, we would like to shed some light on the recent developments of the market standards and share the experience of the organizations that are already developing biodiversity credits. So to kick off the webinar, I would like to invite Samruddhi Kothari from Nature Finance to give a brief presentation on the recent work of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits. Sam?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, evening, afternoon, for wherever you are. And I would like to first of all, thank the Alliance for having me here today. And as Gregor mentioned, that I'm here to kind of just provide a very brief overview of the International Advisory Panel. Just a bit about me and how I was associated with the IAPB is I supported our former CEO of Nature Finance, Simon Zatek, who is one of the founding members of the IAPB. Founding panel members, and I was the rapporteur of the stewardship and the governance working group. Could I have the next slide, please? Just a quick of why did IAPB form? IAPB was launched in June of 23 at the Paris Summit for a new global financing pact as a collaboration between the UK and the French government. Its purpose was very clear, was to reverse biodiversity loss by creating high integrity financial mechanisms. Out here, focus, of course, on the biocredits. At the heart of IAPB's missions were three clear goals: was to establish a transparent and credible biocredit market, to act as a bridge between local stakeholders, such as the government, private sector, civil society organizations, and nature stewards, and operationalize a sustainable financing mechanism, in this case, the biocredit that's aligned with the GBF. Next slide, please. I want to provide a brief overview of the structure and the deliverables. As I mentioned just a minute ago, that the IAPB was kind of focused on acting as a bridge. At top down, it kind of operated through a global panel of over 25 experts from various sectors such as finance, academia, NGOs, indigenous networks, and sustainable businesses in the private sector. And IAPB had also identified what the key market challenges were, and in that sense, kind of formed 5 working groups to address potential solutions or guidances based on those market challenges, which were measurement, demand, supply, governance, and stewardship. And at the end of about an 18-month-long consultation period, the deliverables were comprehensive working group paper offerings actionable insights and a set of 21 high-level principles, which were co-developed with the BCA, which is a Biodiversity Credit Alliance, and the World Economic Forum. I encourage, if you all haven't already, but I definitely encourage this group to review the working group papers, which will be really helpful for some actionable insights. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the framework was co-developed with BCA and the World Economic Forum. It was anchored in 21 principles, which were mainly focused on verified outcome, equity, and transparent governance. And the key idea was to provide a guidance for governments, developers, and investors, the high-level principles. Next slide, please. And here, just based on the audience, I would like to kind of spend just a little time of mine to focus on how, or what my insights were on how they could help the developers. And also, I would like to clarify that the IAPB framework and its principles were not designed for developers, instead kind of to serve as a broader guide for multiple stakeholders. So these were my key takeaways on what or how it would be helpful for this group, is what basically the framework advocated for. I mean, after an 18-month-long consultation, the 3 or the 4 core development parameters that the IAPB came up with was that biocredits needed to be local to local, where they must directly address local impacts. There was a consensus over all the working groups and the panel that it definitely has to avoid international offsetting, no secondary markets. I think that was like key. There was a key push that they don't advocate for secondary market trading, and and they should and the biocredit markets should focus on project-specific approaches, fully aligning or acknowledging the heterogeneity of the credit, and that's something that it cannot be standardized like a carbon credit. The projects had to be tailored to, I would say, local, ecological, and community context, and there needs to be an emphasis on measurable biodiversity gains. Somewhere what also might be helpful was there was an alignment on how the credits could be used, or some of the market models that we saw after having a lot of conversation was, of course, at the sovereign level were biodiversity offsets or compensation for localized biodiversity impacts. Also within supply chain improvements, or something like what we call insetting, voluntary contributions to broader nature positive goals, and carbon credit models, hybrid, which could be bundled and stacked. So these were some of the insights that I thought that could be pulled from the framework. Again, I encourage this group to read the framework for further information. And next slide, please. Just a quick overview, and based on my experience with the IAPB, these were some of the key steps and potential opportunities that IAPB has envisioned in its 2.0 version. Was how do you advance the biocredit markets? Was, of course, socializing the framework, mobilizing early adopters, where efforts are focused on engaging with governments, MDBs, and private actors to pilot and test the framework in real world context. Of course, learning from those pilots and kind of sharing those learnings and knowledge within their networks. And one of the key advocacy point was the inclusion of Indigenous people and local communities as equal partners, and continuing to advocate for them as equal partners in biocredit projects, and to ensure like long-term stewardship. Very quick, brief 7-minute overview. And I hope it's helpful in some context. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Samruddhi. Amazing amount of thought condensed into 7 minutes, as you said. That's wonderful. Our next speaker is Tim Coles, who is CEO of Replanet, which funds ecosystem restoration and protection in 8 countries at last count. And we're very lucky to have Tim, who is, I believe, in Costa Rica. Early morning for you, Tim. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm just having a share. Okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Oh, right. Hello, everybody. We just heard about the failings of the carbon markets, but there was one big success of the carbon market, and that was at least they started with a unit of change. Everybody agrees that a unit of climate change is a ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so you have lots of different methods, but they're all producing outputs in that format. Biodiversity set off without trying to do that at all. They set off producing outputs in completely different formats. So if you are producing in format a project in using one method, you can't compare it to another project that's produced by a completely different method. So back in 2021, what we tried to do, and I sort of led a group of about 60 organizations worldwide. They include lots of the sort of financial institutions and academics and consultants and so forth. And the idea was to try and at least agree what a unit of biodiversity change was. Because if you could get that, you could then use it for accounting. So if corporates were spending money on projects, they could at least then quantify what the benefit was that they were gaining from their biodiversity. And so the way we approached it was to look at, basically take inspiration from the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of goods and services that every country prices up every year, and we compare inflation rates around the world. But every country's got a completely different basket of goods and services. So they should, because that's what they're buying. So if you can use that for high finance, why can't you use the same for conservation? Why can't you have a basket of metrics that reflect the conservation objectives of what you're trying to achieve for that particular set of habitats that you're submitting? So they'll be very different. If you're dealing with a coral reef in Indonesia that's been bomb-fished and cyanide fish, you'd be looking at rugosity and coral cover and species richness and abundance of piscivorous and herbivorous fish and the same species richness and biomass of commercially exploited invertebrates. But if you're rewilding a site in southern England, they tend to be pretty useless metrics. You're going to be doing completely different things like soil invertebrates and breeding birds and so forth. And so the concept was to have a minimum of 5 taxa, one of which is a structural taxa, physical, like habitat structure or physical structure of a reef and so forth, plus at least 4 faunal and floral taxa. And I'm talking about complete taxa now. I'm not talking about individual indicator species. And what you do is you measure those at time 1, and you get a list. Let's say you've got a list of your species of birds, but not all birds are the same value. Some are much more important than others because they're rare or their populations have crashed and so forth. And so you grade those on a 5-point scale, 5 being the most important, 1 being the least important. And just to give you an idea of why that's crucial to any calculation, I did a lot of work in the Fiji forests. And if you go into a Fiji forest, you'll be lucky to find a really good Fiji forest. You'll be lucky to find 20 breeding birds. If you go into the sugarcane fields next to it, you've got 30 to 40 species. So on straightforward mean species abundance, chop down those horrible primary rainforests and replace them with sugarcane. But if you grade each of those species according to their conservation value, 5 being important, all of the ones in the forest are actually critically endangered, and virtually none of those in the sugarcane are critically endangered. They're usually common. There are 1, sometimes invasive, and therefore 0. Now, the second thing you have to do is you have to look at relative abundance changes. We had in the introduction, 70% of the biodiversity is declined. That's populations, it's biomass. And what you've got to do, unless you are accounting for relative abundance or changes in biomass, then you're not really quantifying biodiversity properly. So for each species, we have a reference. We have a reference site for each project. So if it's an uplift project, it's what that site is likely to become in, or you're hoping it to become in sort of 30 years, etc., with the same sort of management. If it's an avoided loss site, it's what it will become if you don't do an intervention in order to protect that particular site. And you look at the abundances of the species in each of those sites, your site and your reference site, and you then score each of those species on a quintile basis, again 5. So the top number, as it were, is a 5, and the least number is the lowest is a 1. So you've now got your abundance and your relative value measures for each species. You multiply those together, add them up for the whole taxa, and that gives you a starting score for your site. You do that for each of the taxa. When you come along again in a few years and remeasure, of course, each of those taxa have changed. And they'll have changed, those numbers should have gone up, we hope, if you've done it properly. And but the percentage they've gone up from the baseline will vary. And in order to get the overall change, we take the median of those values and multiply those by the number of hectares, which gives you the number of units of biodiversity gain that you can achieve for that particular site. Try and go to the next slide. There we go. Right, so what I've told you so far, I hope you've noticed you could cheat that system. You could say, well, I tell you what, for my metrics, let's choose mosquitoes because they improve it, they increase ever so quickly. And to avoid cheating, what we have is an independent academic peer review stage. It's called the Biodiversity Futures Initiative. I started working with the carbon bodies and tried to do academic peer review through them, but it was so poor, the level of verification, that it was much better that we had a completely independent group of academics, and they are rigorous. So if I go along to them and say, look, I think I've got a 50% increase in 1,000 hectares, they'll ask me for all the data. So if I've been doing metabarcoding or eDNA, they don't want the printout, they want the raw bioinformatics. They want the camera trap data, the sound data, all your field data sheets, and your R coding. And what they do is they take a sample of each of those metrics and they compare from the raw data, compare it to the data sheets. If that passes, you then move on to the next stage where you recalculate each of the metrics, and then they say one or three things. Yes, Tim, you've got your 50% increase. No, you haven't. You've made a mistake. It's closer to a 40% increase. Or worst of all, go away. You've done this so badly, we can't possibly quantify the uplift. So in order to avoid that stage happening, they introduced a stage 1 process. And this is where, this is a crucial part of the whole methodology. So we identify what the project is that we're running, what the interventions are, what metrics we're proposing to use, what methods to quantify each of those metrics, and how we're stratifying our samples, because you don't stratify each metric necessarily in the same way, and how many replicates you're doing. And that's an iterative process. And our experience so far is that whatever you put in there, they're going to change it in some way, but it goes through this iterative process. And at the end of it, you've then got a recipe that if you follow that recipe, you can't fail. You can't be slung out at the end because you measured the wrong things in the wrong way. You won't necessarily get your biodiversity uplift. Yep, so again?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. All right, so that then ends up with a definition of a unit of biodiversity change as a 1% gain per hectare in the median value of a basket of taxa that reflect the conservation objectives for the habitats with additionality, that's crucial, and permanence. That definition works for BFI, it works for Vera, it works for Plan Vivo. And we see that as the likely unit of biodiversity change. Notice I don't say in there there have to be a minimum of 5 taxa, so you can have a gradation of the quality of that unit depending on the number of taxa that are surveyed. So you can use it in lots of different ways. If I've only got 2 minutes left, I will explain very quickly here what we're doing. The main income at the moment comes from carbon. That's an existing market. So what we're doing here in Costa Rica is we've got 30,000 hectares of cattle land that's been very badly overgrazed, which we're restoring. We offer between 5 and 30% reforestation, and the rest of the land we put into rotational grazing, which increases the carbon in the soil, increases the carbon in the forest, increases biodiversity. That's what we're really after, to create these wildlife corridors. But most importantly, it increases farmer income and number of cattle that will be held. So we're not trying to remove cattle. And that has quantification of biodiversity using this method. Now, the old method is to use a thing called climate, community and biodiversity standard. And that's a tick box exercise. Are you interested in biodiversity, tick, etc. What we're trying to do is say, look, we'll quantify the biodiversity as a result of this. So that as a buyer, you can say, okay, we're sourcing our carbon credits from projects that have at least a 50% increase in biodiversity. And that helps increase the appeal of the carbon and the value of that carbon. Now, this is a $20 million project, but we have a pipeline of investors looking at $200 million worth of investment in exactly this sort of project. Carbon-led, because they know what the prices are for that, but with quantified units of biodiversity gain. And we see that as a crucial.
Time.
Is that time up now? I can finish with a rewilding one. Okay, I'll just make a very quick rewilding one. This is where biodiversity credits, though, are being issued separately in addition to the carbon, because there's not enough carbon here to make this project actually work on its own. And so you can issue credits by going for the BFI's approval, but then only taking 80% of that claim and monetizing that in units of 1% gain per hectare. And they're issued then on a Swiss blockchain system. So I'll stop at that point then.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Moving swiftly on to Kane Blythe, who is Chief Exec and founder of Ecosulis, and also CreditNature, which is their biodiversity credit spin-off company. Kane, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce you the CreditNature system, and in particular how we've integrated key science principles and concepts of rewilding into our approach. I don't know if you're familiar with the book that Dr. Paul Jepson and I published back in 2020, titled Rewilding, the Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery. You might be interested to know that this book has very much been a catalyst for a lot of the work that we're now doing in CreditNature. Paul, you may know, is a co-founder of CreditNature and has published quite widely on rewilding science and practice. And Paul's research and the work that we've done in the book together has very much informed the structure and development of the system that we've got in relation to things like landscape monitoring, how to attract investment into rewilding projects, as well as how we issue nature credits. The CreditNature approach was originally conceptualized back in 2020, and throughout the development of our framework and tools, we've ensured that all of our developments embed the Rewilding Europe rewilding principles. In fact, Paul was one of the key contributors to the development of these principles. We've also been informed by the progressive science coming out of rewilding circles such as Perino, rewilding complex ecosystems, the very popular theory of cyclic vegetation turnover from Franz Vera, and ecospace work undertaken by Bromberg et al., including accounting for things like the effect of both abiotic and biotic functions and processes in terms of landscape evolution. And what this means is that when CreditNature refer to a landscape connectivity metric, for instance, we're not just recording the presence and absence of features in the landscape. We're actually looking much more at how do different types of barriers and connectivity features affect the ability of different species to disperse through a landscape and the interaction of those species at scale. For instance, as you'll know, the science tells us that different large mammal fauna, particularly herbivores, have an outsized effect within a landscape due to the many ecological and physical interactions. And we measure this within our trophic function metric, for example, by recognizing that different mammalian interactions result in a wide variety of natural disturbances, which result in a diversity of vegetation types and structure. Our system recognises, for example, that in rewilding systems there should be open-ended management philosophy, where we want to increase the messiness of rewilded landscapes within naturalised habitats and ecosystems, thereby moving away from neat, compartmentalised and anthropogenic habitat units. We recognise that the type and accuracy of data gathered can vary across the world, and our system assesses this against strict criteria that will give you a data quality score and make recommendations for improvements to data quality. For each of our characteristics, we can take data from satellites, drones, camera traps, and field observations. These data are then converted into a score from 0 to 100, each point relative to the other, based on algorithms derived from scientific literature and expert elicitation. These assessments are then undertaken on an annual basis, giving the means to assess change for each characteristic over time. And then we combine them into a geometric mean. This provides a standardized and consistent way of comparing changes across landscapes and to measure changes in the overall ecosystem condition. In fact, our Ecosystem Condition Index is the first and only independently accredited ecosystem condition in the world. It's important because this aligns with the international principles, guidance, and frameworks relating to metrics, governance, crediting, and how this might fit in with the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, as well as the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounting. This is important to corporates and others who are looking to value units of change on the balance sheet. We purposely chose to have our system accredited by Accounting for Nature because they're the only independent accounting standard with a credible track record. They've been around for over 15 years and have international expert panel, scientific panel, who have assessed many different types of methods over that time. Many of the other standards or initiatives that you'll see or hear about have only been around for a year or so, if that, and aren't very well tested. The system we have has been accredited for 38 ecoregions across the UK and Europe. And because of the way the standard works, we're now working towards extending this accreditation across Africa and the Americas. We've been very fortunate and we've had great support from and finance from the Scottish Government and other teams over the last 2 years, with over £500,000 of investment where we've tested lots of different land models for the application of the methodology. This investment has actually resulted in an update to the Scottish Natural Capital Markets Framework to include the development of an ecosystem restoration code, the first draft of which CreditNature co-authored with the Scottish Government. The aim is provided detailed guidance on how to develop projects, including rewilding projects, utilising an approved code of practice. And then CreditNature has digitised this ecosystem restoration code, enabling landowners, communities and project developers to build out their own projects, excuse me, following a standardised approach that is linked to the Ecosystem Condition Index. Our aim is to minimise the need for expensive intermediaries and project developers and give local communities, Indigenous peoples, land managers, rangers and rewilding specialists the opportunity to upload their own data into the system to visualise land management practice that are ongoing, provide and plan and develop projects in accordance with the different types of land management practices that fit the context of their landscapes. The system supports many hundreds of different land management practices, including those relating to rewilding, helping you design your own project. Once the practices have been selected, the platform allows you to build your own budgets for delivery, accurately representing the true cost of delivery for different land management practices over a defined time period. You can then submit the data to be independently verified and validated and feed your data into the platform whenever it's updated. These data are then converted into visualizations and dashboards that help monitor changes in ecosystem condition over time. So we're still in the process of improving the visual appeal of the platform, but the fully operable beta platform will be launched in February. And the marketplace will then provide an opportunity for a large audience of potential investors and buyers to invest in the project. So if there's anyone here on the call who's interested in uploading their project to the platform, please do feel free to email me afterwards and I'll ensure that you're sent an invitation once it's launched in February. So the system we've developed has been tested on multiple sites across Scotland and England, and we have over 100,000 hectares of land supply. We're also expanding rapidly across Africa as well as Central and Southern America. We've many investment-ready projects, including 2 that are attracting funding. Drumadoon is the first, where we've a letter of exclusivity with a UK national corporate interested in funding the project, as well as an off-taker who's committed to purchasing credits on an annual basis. Similarly, for Carhay, we now have funding for the first 2 years of the project, and the same off-taker has committed to purchase credits annually as well. Interestingly, the type and use case really varies depending on the audience. We're working with philanthropists, impact funds, corporations, private individuals, and government agencies. Some of them want credits, some of them don't want credits, some just want to monitor the performance of their land assets, but also then to have the option of stacking multiple different types of credits in the future. And so we've developed quite a lot of different models that allow for alignment with those different investment or reporting needs. And the way we work is that we agree a time frame with the land and rights holders to outline how the funds will be released based on delivery of key activities and outcomes via an escrow fund. Our approach allows for verified nature credits to be generated every 2 years or less frequently if that's something that's required. And the CreditNature approach is the outcome of a lot of different collaborations, initiatives and partnerships. We've been very fortunate that the way we've developed the system is the result of a lot of testing, a lot of collaboration, workshops, an advisory panel. And our aim is to make sure that it's very much fit for nature as well as fit for finance and aligned with rewilding principles, science and concepts, enabling the most cost-effective, scalable and impactful nature credit system globally. So I hope this presentation's given you a good understanding of our approach, and I'm more than happy to answer further questions. Do email me if you're interested in having some direct contact, or follow me on LinkedIn if you're interested in our updates. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Kane. A lot to think about there. Our next speaker is Stuart Slabbert, who is Director for Innovative Finance at Conserve Global. I believe, Stuart, you're based in Johannesburg. Stuart,
that's correct. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I am in Joburg, yes.
That's great. Welcome. You have the floor.
Thanks very much. While we're waiting for the presentation to load, just to say that this is a quick presentation on a project perspective. I represent a NGO called Conserve Global. And essentially what we're doing, if we go to the next slide, is we're looking at managing large landscapes, primarily across Africa right now. We've got some work in the Middle East that we're expanding to. And our mission is really to conserve these wilderness landscapes by forging solutions on the ground with local communities. If you go to the next slide, one of those projects that we are involved with that specifically relates to the biodiversity credit is this project right in the northeastern corner up in Zambia, where we are specifically focused on the dark orange landscape, the Tondwa Game Management Area, and we're also doing some work on the neighboring GMA called Kaputa. Essentially what we do is we put teams on the ground, we work with communities, we create a local institution, and we do rehabilitation work, we do conservation management work, and then we do interventions in the community to improve livelihoods or kind of mitigate the risks that are causing biodiversity loss. So with this in mind, specifically, we've been working with, if we go to the next slide, we started off a biodiversity credit trial probably about 1.5 years ago, looking at this landscape, which is an incredibly rich, diverse landscape, you know, big river systems, water systems, incredible forested areas as well, interspersed with these huge grasslands, but it's got 80,000 people that live and depend on that for their daily livelihoods. So we're looking at, besides our conservation intervention, is to work with potential nature finance options like biodiversity credits or carbon credits, where we can unlock additional value to help us not only conserve this area, but then intervene to mitigate these key risks. And the way that we've done that, if we go to the next slide, is we started a biodiversity credit trial with Value Nature originally. and it's now transitioning at the moment with a partnership with CreditNature. So Kane's explained their process very nicely, and we're not going to try and cover that technical ground again. But essentially, the methodology that we're looking at, just from a project perspective, is if you look at the circle over here, through management interventions, and I'll show you a couple of examples now, by improving that land management, we are then improving our ecosystem and our biodiversity around that. And in turn, that provides the ecosystem services to be restored across that landscape. And we can then benefit from those ecosystem services. So just going to the next slide very quickly. What we've then done across this landscape, both the Tonga and the Caputo region, is we have started with a bunch of baseline surveys. We started with a socioeconomic survey that covered our entire region, very extensive, over 80,000 people, as I mentioned. That gave us a baseline of what we're dealing with from a socioeconomic perspective. The little polygons that you see here are different zones that we divided our landscape up into. And within each of these zones, we have a series of biodiversity monitoring protocols and systems in place, from camera traps to actual transects, vegetation assessments, satellite imagery assessment. We've got bioacoustic monitoring or sound monitoring that picks up, kind of the different biodiversity sound. And what we're doing with this is, over a period of the project, Biodiversity Credit project will run for about a 20-year period. But we're trying to build, firstly, a baseline of our biodiversity in terms of its existing state, and then to have a look at the change over time through the management interventions that we bring. So obviously an improvement in any of those biodiversity scorecards then helps us provide a gain, and we can then claim the credit on it. So we just go to the next slide, which is the one I want to concentrate on a little bit. The conference organizers asked us a couple of key questions, and I just thought this is probably from a project perspective the most pertinent information. And if we have a look at what are our key challenges and opportunities in a biodiversity project such as ours, first of all, is the demand at the moment is coming mostly from corporations. So if you think about a carbon credit, which you can either trade or you can offset, against the compliance, we don't have that right now, fully developed in biodiversity credit space. So what we're looking at is we're finding quite a bit of interest from corporations that are looking to prove to their shareholders that they are investing into nature positive projects. So that's where the bulk of our interest is coming from at the moment in this space, slightly different from carbon. It's very much voluntary at this stage, until the support industry is built around biodiversity credits. It's very much on a voluntary basis. I'm not going to go into the methodologies. As I said, Kane's covered those. And then on the finance structure, I think this is also where we're having a lot of issues around a project kind of barrier to entry in the space, is that the initial funding to set these projects up, get them going, do a bit of trials, those are all self-funded, from NGOs like ourselves. We were very fortunate that we picked up a Darwin grant to do the biodiversity trial at the moment. So they've picked up from the feasibility stage, helping us through a PDD stage right now. And, revenues will only come from point of sale. So that's kind of one of the key stumbling blocks on getting projects going from a supply perspective, is that seed funding that is necessary just to get them going. It's an incredible lift, to work in these remote areas and actually get them going. Typical timelines on these projects, we register them for 20 years. But the practicality and the reality on the ground is they're only as good as what your mandate is. So if you're not on the ground, being able to manage the process and have your sleeves rolled up and physically being in that landscape, it's quite difficult to guarantee the project outcomes. So, beyond the 20 years that we have like a co-management agreement in that space to manage that landscape, you need to build the local institution capacity and the community's capacity to be able to take those projects on from a longevity perspective, and hopefully then into perpetuity. And then one of the key major challenges that we're seeing in the industry, that everybody's talking about the regulatory side and the methodology side and how do you account for them. But one of the real stumbling blocks that we're finding is on the government and the government's role within the process. Firstly, because they're seeing biocredits like they do carbon credits as a state asset, and therefore they have a very legitimate role in approving those projects. And many of the governments don't understand the space And we're finding that there's a real block around not just understanding them, but having the regulatory frameworks and the technical knowledges to actually approve the projects. So that for us is one of the major problems around government approval. Also then government's understanding about revenue share and benefit share. We're seeing in the carbon markets that a lot of governments are actually demanding 50% of revenues. But if you look on a typical cost of producing that carbon or that biodiversity, taking 50% of the revenue is just not viable. It renders the projects non-feasible. So we need to change that narrative and rather talk about a benefit share, covering the cost of production first, and then the upside could be then shared with governments and obviously communities. And then the last real barrier to entry for us is the carbon cowboy trap. We're seeing it now in the biodiversity space as well, where unscrupulous developers are coming to governments, taking entire provinces or regions, trying to register projects on them, promising them a 50% of revenue, but they have no ability on the ground to create the additionality and to manage effectively and provide impacts and community partnerships. So we need to kind of educate governments. We need to partner with governments and bring them along early on in the process so that we make sure that they understand what they're dealing with. And to have real impact, we need partners like Kane and the work that CreditNature are doing, but also we need that seed funding, and we need governments to be able to build the right regulatory frameworks with understanding to provide approval for us to be able to move forward. So that's just a very quick project perspective from our side. Thanks, Alistair.
That's wonderful, Stuart. Absolutely landed on time. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Our next speaker is Jeanette Gravenstein from African Parks. Jeanette, are you there?
Yes.
Great.
Thanks, Alistair. And morning, afternoon, everyone. Just while the slides come up, so I'm Jeanette Gravenstein. I'm from African Parks within our Nature-Based Solutions department. I'll be taking you through our approach for the verifiable nature unit. We've originally developed this, and we're currently further developing the approach and piloting in partnership with the Land Banking Group. Next slide. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with African Parks, we specialize in protected area management and currently manage 23 parks across 13 countries, local communities, first spans just over 20 years. And essentially what we aim to achieve is to contribute towards the 30 by 30 in Africa and helping to restore and conserve vital ecosystems. Next slide. So before I get into the detail on what exactly the Verifiable Nature Unit is, just a little bit of context on where it's come from and some of the key principles considered in its design and development. So Verifiable Nature Unit, abbreviated VNU. Essentially, this was an approach developed by African Parks, very much with the intent to develop something that is holistic, that can serve various ecosystem types and apply for various land stewards. So from a protected area manager right across to a local community that's managing like a community forest reserve or a smallholder farmer. And it's very much based on our experience of operating for 20 years in very rural and complex environments across the African continent. So some of the key principles, and I mean, we've seen some of these with the other methodologies presented as well, moving away from carbon to something that's much more holistic for all the different types of ecosystem types. We've seen there's much need to move away from very counterfactual sort of methodologies and systems to really looking at what the actual value of a specific ecosystem is and what it could contribute in and of itself. Moving away from an offset mindset to much more nature positive and how can it contribute more towards sort of the biodiversity targets. Moving much towards outcomes-based, so also away from upfront activity funding where there's not necessarily a guarantee of performance to guarantee performance through outcomes-based transactions. And with that, of course, comes the third-party verification and the auditability with the process that whoever the buyer is at the end of the day can really trust what they're buying and that it has actually been achieved. Next slide. So what a VNU is and what it represents is essentially a square kilometer of nature and looking has that been conserved or restored from 1 year to the next, verified by specific measurements. We've used a square kilometer as the size, and this is based on the practicality of what works in terms of where we're working and operating at the moment. But essentially the same approach would apply, be it a hectare or any other sort of unit size that would be relevant to the project. Next slide. So getting into a little bit of detail on what it is made up of. So there are various layers to the VNU. And the first is descriptors. So that's essentially to provide information to a buyer on where is this nature, where is this ecosystem that they're contributing towards, who's managing it, what are the social economic linkages, what is its designation, what type of ecosystem is it, what ecosystem services there are. So all that background information to give you really information about that area. Inputs, so that's around what the actual cost of management is to achieve the nature outcomes. And something that we felt was very important to include in these type of methodologies to build a lot more accountability and transparency around what does it actually take to achieve these outcomes of conservation and restoration at the end of the day. The third element is in the outcomes of what is actually measured. So we've got two core measurements of habitat intactness and indicator species. So habitat intactness is basically remote sensing. So to look at how habitat degradation is taking place due to negative human pressures, and then how that changes over time. So for example, how is nature being transformed due to settlements or deforestation or agriculture? And secondly is indicator species present in abundance through on-the-ground field monitoring and looking across the different trophic levels, how those different species are over time. Then we the third, which is more flexible, to include additional elements depending on the project and the buyer needs. So depending on if it's, for example, a protected area versus a more farming type of project. So it could include, for example, sequestration or soil and water quality. Next slide. Just also to mention, so how we've developed the VNU, it's basically a tool to assist with measuring nature outcomes. The intent is it's not necessarily a biodiversity credit or nature credit, but it measures nature outcomes, and those can then be used as a basis for various nature financing mechanisms. So it could be a nature credit, but it could also be used for a bond or debt for nature swap or a pay for performance grant. So the pilots that we're busy doing at the moment fall actually more in the pay for performance grant. And eventually these may transition to be used for some others. But the idea is that we're really trying to develop critical infrastructure for the nature market. And this we see as key to really scaling this and mobilizing funds from various different sources. So philanthropy, financial institutions, corporates, so that there's various mechanisms that suit each of these different buyers. Next slide. Okay, so just a quick overview of how the methodology works. Next slide. So we ran a proof of concept for one of our parks in Malawi, Majeti Wildlife Reserve, and used historical data just to look and see how the methodologies actually work in practice. So this just gives you a bit of an idea of what it actually looks like with implementing those two core indicators of habitat intactness and indicator species. So this is then applied across the area and gives you a final score at the end of the day for each year. Issuance is then based on the change between years. So on you being able to demonstrate, for example, from 2023 to 2024, that you've conserved or restored the ecosystem. And then next slide, just to dive into the details on each of these. So this is the habitat intactness testing aspect. So for Majeti, we've been operating there since 2003. So this just gives you an idea of the change in time that we're looking at with the habitat intactness. We looked at agriculture, tree loss, and built up an infrastructure. And you can see between 2003 and 2023, how there's been a lot of agriculture that's taken place around Majeti. Also settlement expansion in the national park just south of Majeti. There's also quite a lot of tree loss that's been picked up. So it gives you a good idea of what is actually happening in terms of transformation of nature. Next slide. Then on indicator species, so we've defined 10 different groups across the different trophic levels, with the idea that you would then select species within each group that you would then measure their performance. Next slide. This gives an idea. So we've taken a migratory group. So you, for example, have an observation. Each observation is then given a buffer of where it's present. You have an indicator that you would have to measuring, but it would be that you'd have a sampling plan on how it's measured and where each of the observations are taking place. Yes, 2 minutes.
It might be good to turn off your video. I don't want to ask you to do it, but just some of your speech is a bit patchy. So maybe turn off the video. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry about that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, and then this is basically the overall picture with the indicator species. So for each of those groups, then you would have your different observations. You would then consolidate that into a single score for the area. And that then gives you the score for your indicator species. So the habitat and intact indicator species are then consolidated into a final score, which is then your ecosystem integrity, which then informs your issuance. Next slide. Okay, this is the final slide. So we've currently got 4 pilots that are ongoing across our portfolio, Majeti, Malawi, DRC, Congo, and Chad. So in 2024, we issued 711 VNUs, and we're aiming to issue just over 13,500 in 2025 and 2026. So it's about for 1.3 million hectares. So we're busy trialing that within the national parks themselves. And the intent is with our next phase that we'll then also start trialing the methodology in partnership with local communities. So for example, in community managed conservation areas or with agriculture and regenerative agriculture, to also test how we use this in different types of use cases. Next slide. And then that's the final slide. So yes, thank you everyone. So if there's, just added my email address on the slide if there's any questions or more detail needed. Thank you very much.
That's wonderful, Jeanette. Thank you very much. Landed bang on time. So our final speaker is Mauricio Serna from Terrasos in Medellin in Colombia. Mauricio, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Alistair. Thank you. So, as Alistair said, I'm going to talk to you about biodiversity credits in Colombia, the 30-year high integrity conservation project that we have. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little about Terrasos. Terrasos is a Colombian company. We've been in the market for about 10 years now, mostly for the compliance market in terms of biodiversity offsets. And our vision is to preserve and restore threatened ecosystems through environmental investments in exceptional conservation projects. The exceptional part is really important because we construct projects that are legally, financially, and technically sound for 30 years, and we call them habitat banks, but I'm going to explain that a little bit further. So we have 12 projects registered in Colombia. That's about 6,000 hectares, 25 different biomes in one of the world's most biodiverse country in the world. And it's important to note that we are achieving and generating financial flows to ecosystems that are not being served by the carbon market. So on the left, you'll see a map where I show you the carbon sequestration potential of Colombian ecosystems. That's mainly in the Amazon and in the Pacific coast of Colombia. However, we are delivering outcomes, biodiversity, like positive biodiversity outcomes and financial flows to the most threatened ecosystems in Colombia that are in the middle of the country, in the central part of the country. So we all know that biodiversity is really important, both for global food crops, for modern medicines, and that biodiversity is especially critical for climate adaptation and mitigation. And as we've been all saying, there's a lot of biodiversity in risk, and that's why we are focusing on biodiversity and not on carbon to deliver positive outcomes both for nature and people. So the problem that we are solving here is that biodiversity projects in Colombia and most parts of the world are short-term conservation initiatives dispersed interventions, not result-oriented, and money is being wasted. This is an example of a traditional biodiversity offset site here in Colombia that the biodiversity offset project was abandoned after the environmental authority checked it out. And then the project got burned because there were no stewards, like in the long term of the project. So our solution is to register habitat banks that are a mechanism that is based on the payment for success. So the status quo on how biodiversity projects in Colombia are done is in the graph in the left, dispersed interventions, and what we are solving is that we are channelizing the funds from companies from the compliance market, the funds from companies from the voluntary market, individuals who want to invest in nature, and NGOs who want also to invest in nature to specific projects, bigger projects that have early investment, that are based on performance-based payments, that the land is secure for 30 years, as I was mentioning, through financial transparency and traceability. I'm going to show a little bit about that further. Because we have economies of scales, we can reduce cost of transactions, and we can reduce the financial risk and uncertainty for clients. So at the end, habitat banks sell biodiversity units or credits. So we have the two markets, 10 square meters for the voluntary market. We have a protocol that it's online, it's on our website. I'm not going to focus on the protocol and on the methodology in this presentation. So we have the 10 square meters voluntary biodiversity credits or units that we call TBUs, Terrasos biodiversity units, and we have the 1 hectare credits that are for the compliance market. Both of them are for 30 years in our habitat banks, and these biodiversity credits include all the attributes that are needed to maintain and to sustain the projects for 30 years. That includes land sourcing and due diligence. That is really important in Colombia due to our history and due to all that we've been through in our recent history. There's a lot of land grabbing and a lot of illegal land grabbing. So we need to do proper due diligence in order to have 30-year projects that are sound legally. We do tree planting, land lease, fencing, transportation, monitoring, local capacity development, risk mitigation through insurances, reporting both to authorities and to clients, land taxes, trust fund fees, monitoring permits, legal counseling, communication, and project management. And all of our credits are permanent contributions to protection in highly degraded ecosystems. I'm going to repeat: 1 hectare for compliance, 10 square meters for voluntary, both are 30 years, and all of our projects and all of our credits are only released for sale when milestones are met, and that's where we accomplish the performance-based mechanism. I wanted to show you this and how financially our projects work. So this is a financial flow on, we have early investors. So at the beginning of the graph, then we start selling the credits when we accomplish ecological and management milestones. So we expect to sell the credits in the first 12 years of the project, where we expend also money in all the management of the land and in securing monitoring, verifiers, et cetera, and in securing also biodiversity gain in time. And what's interesting here is that we're creating a pension fund for nature. So for every dollar we receive for the revenue for the sales of our credits, we are allocating between 10 to 40% of each dollar to a pension fund or to a wasting account for the future. That this wasting account will grow up until year 13, more or less, and we will expend this wasting account or this pension fund to maintain the project for 30 years. And in terms of governance, meeting the IAPB principles that we talked about, this is like how our projects work. So we partnership with communities that are the owners of the project. We have different types of projects, but the most complex are the ones that we partnership with communities that are the owners of the project. We create private agreements with them. So Terrasos chips in as an investor and as the structurer, and we seek for investors as well that are looking either for a revenue or that are willing to put their money into these conservation projects. We create a trust fund that is the fund that will manage all the resources of the project, and the clients will pay the credits to this trust fund. And this trust fund with some guidelines that will manage the resources and that will pay for the management and the goods and services of the manager, the operator of the project in the field, and that this trust fund will also pay for the registry platform, the verifier, the third-party verifier, the tech platform, and will allocate the funds to the sustainability account. Here, we are meeting principles of the IAPB in terms of verified outcomes for the third verifier, the equity, because the project, the community is the owner of the project, and they are the ones who are receiving the funds, transparency, traceability, and governance through the tech platform. And I just wanted to end. There's a lot of questions about how and where the demand is coming from biodiversity units. And from our experience, and we have a bunch of clients in these different use cases, I wanted to present our experience in where is the demand coming from. So there's a demand in Colombia at least, and we are also like looking in different countries of Latin America, and this same model applies to different countries of Latin America. So the demand is coming from mandatory actors. Here we have environmental regulation, in terms of biodiversity offsets, subtraction of reserve areas, and different laws in different countries. We have financial regulations. Here there's an example that a financial institution has a specific requirement to the lender. In order for them to lend the money, the company who is receiving the money has to invest in biodiversity credits, additional to the mandatory compensation or offsetting laws of the country. And there is demand coming from the voluntary sector. So also the financial sector is asking companies to invest in biodiversity in order to lend money, not mandatory, but they will have better scores in order for them to receive the money. Reporting standards, we think this is the bigger part of the cake that will incentivize demand. So companies that are wanting to report to TNFD, to GRI, to Dow Jones Sustainability Index, or to any of the CSR standards, they will buy biodiversity credits, and they are buying biodiversity credits at the moment. Interest groups, so position itself from the corporate sector as a company that is biodiversity positive and enhancing reputation with their end clients. We also see, we don't have an example from this yet, but we also see the public sector chipping in and buying biodiversity credits to promote social investments in remote areas through a project that is based on results, and also NGOs and philanthropy sector that want to guarantee their positive impacts and that their money is going to biodiversity projects that are based by payment for result mechanisms. So this is the use cases we're working on, and I think this is really important for the discussion that we will have later. This is my email, this is my WhatsApp. If you want to email me, feel free. And thank you very much for our invitation here to the Global Rewilding Alliance.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mauricio. I've got a couple of questions coming into the Q&A function. I'd like to ask a couple of questions just to start with, just big picture questions. First, I mean, so it strikes me that there's a couple of sort of big picture ones. One is, what stage are we at, do you think, in the development globally of biodiversity credits? Do you think we're still in the early stages, or is this moving into a sort of a more credible phase where people can reliably invest in this kind of thing? And sort of tied to that in a more specific way is, what advice would you give to rewilding organizations or projects on how to navigate this landscape? Because we've seen a number of really interesting different approaches, and without just saying come to us, we've got all the answers. What would you say to those, Kane?
Thanks, Alistair. Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely early. There is increasing interest in nature credits, and particularly we're experiencing those that offer multiple co-benefits, so not just isolated biodiversity benefits. I think most, certainly coming from the private sector, most investors are interested in carbon, they're interested in water attenuation, a good news story about well-being and social equity, for example. So there's a lot of interest in this more holistic approach, and what we're seeing, our experiences, it's relatively easy. I think you've probably heard through all the presentations, it's relatively easy to find willing landscapes and projects and communities to get involved. And what we're doing certainly throughout the UK and Africa is starting to work with partners on matchmaking, so making sure that the interests of those who want to invest align with the interests of those who are offering land supply, and that the credits that are being generated deliver on those benefits over a prolonged period of time. So that's quite a distinct difference to how we set out. We were sort of started with working with lots of really enthusiastic landscapes. And actually, you've got to do both. You've got to come from the demand side as well as the supply side.
Great, thanks, Kane. Tim.
Okay, I mean, to answer your question, is the market ready yet for biodiversity credits? The answer is definitely no. And the reason for that is nobody knows what the price is. If I go to an investor, a carbon investor, and say, look, give me 20 million for a project, they'll look at the prices we're going to produce carbon credits for and decide whether they can make an investment on that basis. If I go to them and say, give me 20 million for a biodiversity credit project, they'll just laugh at me because they have no idea what the prices are going to be. And so in order to get this started, you have to get biodiversity credits trading. And the way to do that is through philanthropy. So the sort of work that's happening with, with African parks and so forth, where you're getting investors who are interested in the biodiversity. They think it's a worthwhile project anyway. They're investing in it anyway. Why not give them units of biodiversity gain or credits, as it were, so they can then put those onto the market and start trading? And that's the way we think. It's certainly for rewilding, because it's such a sexy topic. That's a massive advantage you've got, Alistair. You're not trying to sell cattle land. You're trying to sell something that is really exciting, and the story is great behind that. And as a result of that, it's likely to attract philanthropists. But if you attract them, why not offer them the opportunity of quantifying the biodiversity and being able to recoup their initial investment and then hopefully reinvest in you again? So that's the way we see it starting.
A very neat way to start a market. Thank you, Tim. Jeanette.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, also just echoing a little bit what Tim was saying with regards to philanthropy. I mean, we very much see that as quite a catalyst in the whole market development. And we trying specifically to do that is if we can do enough transactions that test these mechanisms, that prove that they work, their nature outcomes are reliable, high integrity, that's really going to push the market forward. So, yeah, philanthropy is key with that. Corporate philanthropy has also got a very important role to play along with that. But yeah, I mean, also to rewilding projects, it's monitoring is one of probably the key aspects to that. I mean, if you've got solid monitoring plans that are monitoring across the area, that's going to fit into various methodologies. So, I mean, there's a lot of work going on with the different pilots, the different methodologies, and eventually it will converge into probably a single couple of standards. But that's probably the key thing, is to have solid, consistent monitoring. Will go a very long way towards enabling biodiversity credits or any of the other nature.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I would encourage everybody here to think about your questions and put them into the Q&A. Firstly, from Omar Khayyam, can the system of mitigation credits used for endangered species impact offset in California be used for biodiversity credits, e.g. habitat banks versus mitigation banks? It's quite a specific question. Don't know if anybody wants to take that one. Might be too specific for the speakers here. That's fair enough. And then a second question. I don't know if speakers can see the questions. Can you see the questions? So there's one from Fabien Quetier. The pension fund approach requires a taxation rate. I think this is primarily for you, Mauricio. Can you see the question? Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I was thinking here, I'm not the financial expert in Terrasos pension fund.
Sorry,
but
Mauricio, just I'm not sure if everybody can see the question.
Okay, so I'm going to read it out loud. Is that okay?
I'll just read it out. The pension fund approach requires a taxation rate that isn't excessive in the first few years, where income from credit sales is concentrated. does Terrasos benefit from a specific tax regime, or is that all down to the funds being in a tax-exempt trust fund?
Okay. So it's a really interesting question. I'm not the expert in the financial part of in Terrasos and in the pension fund, but what I can say is that first, as we sell the credits from year, let's say 3 to year 12, the Habitat Bank is not generating profit in those years. So the Habitat Bank is the fiduciary in those first years. So that's the first. And second of all, it's an accounting approach. So we allocate resources to the fund, and we do not benefit from a specific tax regime. Fabien, if you want, we can discuss this later with the financiers here at Terrasos, because I can just say that.
Okay, thank you. So other questions I had were about barriers. I mean, this is the sort of flip side of one of the other questions that's been asked. What are the barriers you feel we face in order for biodiversity credits to scale? Yes, Mauricio.
So I think the biggest barrier is demand. So I think we all are really experts in biodiversity conservation, in biodiversity like project management, and we know how to manage these projects in the long term. But we are facing a great barrier in terms of demand, and I think that's the trickiest point of biodiversity credits. And we are all trying to solve that problem. In Colombia, there's a really neat environmental compensation law that obligates companies to do environmental offsets, and Terrasos has built it up on that for the last 10 years. But when we go to the voluntary part, it's not really straightforward. How are we going to secure that demand? I think that's the biggest barrier.
Great. I'm going to bring in Stuart next, as you haven't answered the question before.
Yeah, I think from an African perspective, and it's probably very specific to Africa, is just we just can't discount the role that government plays. You know, we can't get a single project approved at the moment. You know, a year and a half down the line of continual engagement in a specific country, let alone scaling to multiple other projects in the portfolio that we have. So I just think that that role of government and trying to bring them along and to create the regulatory environment for approval process for these types of credits, I think is a real stumbling block.
Thank you. Yeah, Kane?
I think just to add to the ones that have already been made, which are very valid, of course. There are two kind of components. One is we're seeing some reticence with landowners, communities, indigenous peoples in terms of how these systems are developing. Also, the opportunity cost of developing something now, let's say a carbon project, that's offering a cheap price on carbon that doesn't really truly reflect the value of the natural assets that are there. I think that's still quite a hesitation, particularly where the same sort of process is being followed for biodiversity credits, where it's forcing the price in a direction which is perhaps not favorable in terms of recognizing true value. I think the other one is it's a similar problem to the carbon markets in that there are players out there at the moment who are signing landowners up to contracts without having done a jot of ground truthing, surveying, assessment, data gathering, project development, actually design, integration of communities into the decision-making process. I think, and they're predicting outcomes and numbers of credits that can be generated through models that were created in another country. And so I think that bad actor component, or perhaps misinformed actor, is a real concern, because it will only take a few really bad projects to undermine the market. So I would recommend very strongly that anyone that does engage with the biodiversity credit organization really tests what level of due diligence and activity has actually been undertaken on the ground before proceeding.
Yeah, wonderful. So we have lost Tim, who had his hand up, but I think the connection in Costa Rica must have dropped. What should we be talking about? I've handed over to the panel. I'm out of questions. Oh, no, hang on a minute. There's more questions coming into the Q&A. I need to scroll. That's what. So Tagway asks, can we have a standard or generic term for biodiversity credits? The following terms were used by the presenters: nature credits, verifiable nature units, Terrasos biodiversity units, etc. I mean, it feels to me like this is early market development, and therefore people are developing their own ideas. And over time, there'll be some sort of convergence. Is that your instinct, Mauricio?
Well, I think the generic and the standard term is biodiversity credits, and that's where the Global Biodiversity Framework states as biodiversity credits. I'm gonna put out the example of Colombia. Here in Colombia, we started promoting biodiversity credits and trying to seek for clients saying biodiversity credits, and most of the companies or the individuals didn't understand the term. They thought we were a financial institution, that we were lending money to do biodiversity conservation projects because of the term credit. And that's where we understood that in Colombia, the term unit was more viable and more understandable, because we were doing an area-based conservation unit at the end. So that's when we started communicating as a unit. But I think the credit is the standard term, and then every company will come up with a term or like a brand, if you may, that is useful to them, I guess.
Very interesting, yes. Local circumstances coming in there, and confusion around language. Jeanette.
Yeah, but our perspective of why we went with nature units, so it goes back to, so we're trying to position it not as a biodiversity credit specifically, but more as measuring nature outcomes, and then it could be a biodiversity credit or nature credit. We also specifically went with nature as opposed to biodiversity, just to be more inclusive, and that you can include the different elements of our carbon sequestration or water, soil, but it's a much more holistic term. And yeah, also that it's a unit, so it's a unit of measurement, not specifically a credit. So, but yeah, eventually it is going to converge as these standards come together. I think that will happen over time, and as we pilot, as we figure out what's going to be the best and most scalable way to do this.
Yeah, I want to keep moving, Kane, so I'm not going to give you this question, but I'll give you another one from Marika. What is the minimum size for a project to use your product or your method in your dashboard?
Thanks. Quick one on that. So the accreditation covers us for sites above 200 hectares. However, our general preference at the moment is above 1,000 hectares, just because we're inundated with land assets, and it's also much easier to be able to create the multiple co-benefits I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, great. A question from the living legend Vance Martin. He says, thank you everyone. To what extent are marine and freshwater habitats in your models? Mauricio.
So I can start if you want. There's a lot of how do I say that in English? There's a lot of motivation from our part to include marine and freshwater habitats in our methodology and in our protocol, because we are like we learned with the Colombian regulation market. The Colombian regulation market is straightforward for terrestrial ecosystems, but is not quite developed for marine or freshwater models. But we are seeking to have partnerships with other institutions that are like willing to structure biodiversity credits in marine or freshwater ecosystems, but we haven't done that yet. So we think we can like add an annex to our protocol to include those types of ecosystems, but there's a lot of interest.
Thank you. Kane?
The methodology we have recognizes freshwater bodies, certainly in the metrics that we've got. We're developing a specialized living rivers index through some of the work we were doing in Scotland with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, although that's still in development. And then on the marine side, we're recently just announced a funded PhD to develop the marine metrics that align with the same NARIA framework that we've used to create the terrestrial and freshwater metrics. And we're also looking at some funding in South Africa to test that as well.
Wonderful. And Fabien Quetier says the wetland mitigation market in the US is the most mature example of a regulated market for ecosystem restoration. Lots to learn. Thank you, Fabien. So I'm going for short questions now. So if you've written a long question, you might have bad luck. Jennifer Gooden says the IAPB recommends avoiding standardization, but other panelists see some standardization as necessary for developing and growing a market. What are the panelists' thoughts on this difference? And we have about 1 minute to answer this question, and then it's over to Mark Haller to close. Yeah, go for it, Kane.
I think it's partly in response to what the private sector wants, which is standardization, and that then aligns with accounting standards through the UN SEEA, as I mentioned previously, as well as new frameworks such as TNFD. What that doesn't mean, though, is that you can then start to add other metrics on top of a standardized index. So that's the approach we're taking. We've got a standardized ecosystem condition index, and then we can bring in other metric systems to answer location-specific requirements for those projects.
Final answer for you, Mauricio.
So I agree with Kane on the standardization of metrics and how do we measure biodiversity, and also like following the IAPB principles, there should be a standardization on the principles. So on the verified outcomes, on the equity, the transparency, and the governance. But going into a standardized unit will be impossible due to the highly biodiverse ecosystems that we have around the world.
Well, fabulous. Thank you to all of our speakers. It's been an incredibly rich discussion. Over to you, Mark, to wrap up. I don't envy you.
Thank you, Alistair. You'll be glad to know that I'm not going to try and summarize everything that's been said. I think it's been a really rich and very encouraging discussion. I am the chair of the board of Global Rewilding Alliance, one of the sponsors of this workshop. And our purpose in organizing these things is to help our members and help our constituency explore new and emerging opportunities, but also new and emerging issues. And of course, the rapid development of biodiversity credit approaches and the slower one of markets is one such that I think we're all grappling with. Now, I think it's clear that this is not a silver bullet, that biodiversity credits are one tool among many to address the problems of biodiversity conservation, but it is of interest for the reasons that Gregor started with, the gap in funding between what's required to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework and the existing sources of funding and likely sources of funding from the public sector. So I think it is incumbent on all of us to explore other possibilities, including those around biodiversity credits. Now, I think just looking at the last year, a huge amount of work has been done. Sam illustrated the work of the IAPB, mentioned the BCA. There are a lot of things going on to try and structure a robust market for biodiversity credit standards. What we would call in nature finance putting together the operating system for biodiversity credit markets. And I think we looked at a number of elements here today. One, of course, is the absolutely fundamental one of building trust. You will not build a market for biodiversity credits that works unless there's trust in the credits themselves and what they are based on. And we have heard quite a bit of scientific approaches, methodological modeling approaches to generating that trust. And it seems to rest on a couple of things. One is the robustness of the baseline. What is the state of biodiversity at the moment that you start the project? And then the robustness of the monitoring and verification system that enables you to ascertain with some certainty what the biodiversity uplift has been. But I think that we have seen also from the discussion here that it's complicated, that things are not straightforward. and that we have, fortunately or unfortunately, the example of the voluntary carbon markets to either warn us about what mistakes we should not make, and also to give us some ideas of what has finally worked. But there are a number of warnings out there, and we covered a few of them today, and I think we're going to need to dig down deeper in them. I think the first lesson is, and it's a drawing from the example of the carbon markets, and that is that it makes sense to work out the governance first and then launch your markets later. What happened in the voluntary carbon markets is that people started going out and trading and offering carbon credits without any kind of agreed governance system being put in place. So I think the integrity of the market, building it quickly, building the highest level of consensus possible on, for example, what is adequate sharing of benefits, what should communities expect to receive from these projects is really going to be important in terms of the long-term success of biodiversity credits. I think we need to find ways of avoiding the sort of carbon cowboy effect, basically the phoniness and lack of integrity of some of the early quick movers in this field who are offering product that really is not viable. We heard a number of times that the role of the state, role of the national governments is difficult, but of course also absolutely fundamental. And we need to develop, I think, codes of practice and approaches that will allow us to bring the state in as quickly as possible and ensure them that their role is well understood and well respected. It does, however, affect the pace at which biodiversity credit markets can develop. There's an issue of upfront costs, as a couple of you have mentioned, and I think it will be quite important for the ecological restoration community, the rewilding community, to work out ways of covering some of those costs, even with loans or some loan facility, if that's at all possible. And it's been pointed out that demand is still weak. I think the explanation for that is not the basic nature of biodiversity credits, but the fact that it's very difficult to know how the market's going to evolve and what price can be secured from biodiversity credits, except in the immediate term. So those are some of the lessons. There's a lot of work to be done. I think what's happened over the past year is really encouraging. There's obviously a huge amount of innovation in this field. There's a huge amount of really serious foundational work that I think augurs well for the future. And what I think we need to do is to continue building biodiversity credit markets, ensuring that we don't fall into any of the bear traps that we've seen with the voluntary carbon markets. And at the same time, ensure that the net result of all of this, the principal net result, is actually the biodiversity uplift, not the income necessarily from the credit itself. So with that, let me first of all thank all of our speakers. I think they've been an extremely interesting and complementary set of presentations, but also illustrating that at this stage in the development of markets, there's room for a great deal of creativity and different approaches that match different circumstances. So I think we've had a good illustration of that. I'd like to thank Alistair, of course, for moderating this session and keeping us roughly on time. I'm 1 minute over, but for which I apologize. And finally, the organizers of this. I think the lesson from these sorts of events, and we've had a few, is that it makes sense for us to continue holding this kind of event and perhaps digging deeper or unpacking some of the specific elements of the challenge that we face. So I think you can assume you will hear from us further, and I hope we can bring you in on further events of this type. So thank you once again. All of the best for you, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to all of our speakers. And
thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.